Good morning, everyone, and I'm so grateful to see students here and faculty, administrators, people from one side of the Pacific, people from the other side of the Pacific. So I'm quite pleased to be here, and I'm noticing that I'm supposed to stand here, and I don't have a PowerPoint, but I hope I can use this. I want to thank the Center for Faith and Inquiry at Gordon College and the Institute for Global Engagement for arranging this conference on God, globalization, and the good society, all important topics to which we need to give attention. I have a finished paper, and it's just modestly too long to read, so I'm going to be focusing on its main points. And given the variety of our listeners, some of whom will be familiar with the Confucian tradition, others will not, I'm hoping to review some themes of that tradition, which will be very familiar to some, and again, others not, in order to engage a kind of comparative conversation about how democracy develops and takes shape in any civilization. My main point that I want to share with you all today, if you look carefully at history, democracy is not achieved by aiming at democracy as a goal. Democracy comes about as the result of two factors. Democracy comes about when people, and a majority of people in a state or nation, are seeking a higher end of noble goods. So you need to be aiming at something higher than democracy to get democracy. That's the first point. And the second is that a plurality of perspectives on how to achieve those higher or noble ends has to be sustained. That plurality of conversations or perspectives on how to achieve that higher end has to be sustained over time. If you have those two factors, probably what will emerge is some form or another of a checks and balances style of democracy, and that's a side effect. That's a byproduct. That's a means for achieving a higher end. So I'm always a little bit concerned when people aim at democracy. If you look at those kinds of efforts where people have aimed at democracy as their goal, those democracies have not lasted for very long. Democracy results at aiming something higher and sustaining a plurality of discussion on how to achieve that higher goal. Then you get something like democracy. And by democracy, I mean political power derived from the people and based upon their voluntary consent. The paper has two parts. So I'm going to be presenting the theme of 25 years ago, but I'm going to be deriving it in different ways. The paper has two parts. The first part is much shorter than the second one. The first part looks at how democracy came about in Western civilization, and I focus on two or three themes there. Since my colleague Yang Fenggang is going to be talking more about Christianity and democratization, I'm going to leave most of that to him. But I have to touch on a few bases of that conversation in order to make the case for Confucianism and democracy that I want to make. As to the first part then, the first part focuses on how Judeo-Christian covenant relating has significantly influenced the development of democracy as a side effect, a byproduct, a means to a higher end. The perspective from which I present these remarks is known as principled pluralism. And to get at a definition of principled pluralism, I'm going to go to that of Jonathan Chaplin, who is director of the Kirby Lang Institute for Christian Ethics as part of Tyndale House in Oxford, England. Chaplin defines principled pluralism in this way. It is a particular stance regarding the proper attitude of the state towards the plural religious affiliations of its citizens. Its central claim is that the role of the state in a religiously diverse society is to maintain a public square equally open to contributions from many faiths, rather than overtly to prefer or privilege any one of them, even Christianity. Chaplin distinguishes principled pluralism from two other positions, that of the Christian nation, which seeks to defend or restore a nation's Christian character, and from the position known as the Christian state, which asserts that if a state has a Christian majority among its citizens, there can be and should be a privileging of the Christian faith in the state's public ceremonies, education, political decisions, and so forth. Chaplin cites from an evangelical manifesto of 2008 to describe principled pluralism. That manifesto was signed by people such as Timothy George, Os Guinness, John Huffman, Richard Mao, David Neff, and Dallas Willard. In this manifesto, principled pluralism is a vision of public life in which citizens of all faiths are free to enter and engage the public square on the basis of their faith, but within a framework of what is agreed to be just and free for all faiths. Therefore, no one faith should be normative for the entire society. Principled pluralists affirm that a diversified nation can exist as a unified moral community held corporately accountable to God without requiring that the state profess or privilege one particular faith, even if that faith had significant influence in the shaping and forming of a nation. To give example to Christian principled pluralism, we will examine very briefly, for comparative purposes, Judeo-Christian influence on the shaping of the Democratic Republic of the United States. Humility before God, mutual trust, humility before God and neighbor, mutual trust, offering hospitality to strangers, voluntary to service to others, even when this requires significant cost to oneself. These are Christian values whose foundation is the two great commandments of the Judeo-Christian heritage. The first commandment is found in Deuteronomy 6:5, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. The second commandment is found in Leviticus 19:18, do not seek to revenge or bear grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Jesus Christ bears witness to both these commandments in Matthew 22:37-40. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. On the law and all the law and prophets hang on these two commands. Now, as to the first command, implicit in that affirmation is that only God is God, and all persons are equal under God, in that no person or group of persons or any created thing is God and can take the position of God. Implicit in the second command is the affirmation that if your neighbor is in need of food, clothing, shelter, or education, and you have these, give of what you have to your neighbor, and do this with love. As biblical citation of the two commandments testifies, Christians received these two commandments from their Jewish forebears, who formed a trans-tribal unity of different groups, whose coming together to form one people under God took place over roughly 1,000 years, 11th century to the 3rd century generally. In modern times, living in accordance with these two commands has also influenced the formation of a trans-tribal unity known as the United States. And I want to take a look very quickly and summarily. There's not enough time to go into a lot of this in detail. I want to look quickly at two scholars. One is Sidney E. Mead, a renowned American historian, author of The Nation with the Soul of a Church. And the other scholar is David Novak, a well-known contemporary Jewish scholar, author of Covenantal Rights, a study in Jewish political theory. Both scholars focus on God's covenant relationship with humanity based on the two commandments. Sidney Mead's work addresses the first of the two commandments, to love the Lord with your heart, soul, and strength, which he shortens to the simple affirmation, no man is God. God transcends all persons, groups, clans, tribes, nation-states, corporations, banking conglomerates, political alliances, scientific associations, technological guilds, mass communications, and more. Given that no one of these groups is God, all of these groups are equal in not being God, equal in not being established to take the part of God. In practice, this equality of persons and groups means no person has privileged access to God, and no group has privileged access to the institutions and structures of government. Thus, the first commandment provides religio-moral foundation for the United States separation of church and state. Based on historical documents, Mead carefully demonstrates that it was the diversity of voluntary religious and ethical associations, each telling the other, "You are not God," that result in the development of checks and balances style democracy in the United States. Indeed, Mead argues that "you are not God" is the founding theology of the American Republic. David Novak, in his Covenantal Rights, a study in Jewish political theory, explores the God-human and human-to-human covenant relation based on the second commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. Despite his title, Novak prefers tradition-based terms such as person, community, claims, and responses over modern secular terms such as individual, society, rights, and duties. I'm going to summarize quickly Novak's 7 main points on covenant. First, the transcendent and eminent personal one, whom Jews, Christians, and Muslims call God, has created and sustained just, right, life-supporting order in the world. Second, as creator, God has claim over every person and thing he created. Third, God gives power to persons and things, enabling them to respond to God's claim over them. Fourth, the claims of God on humans and the claims of human beings on God and each other constitute an interactive covenant relationship which is rational, moral, and freely chosen. 5, whether between God and humans or between human persons, all covenant relationships involve claims and responses under God's just and right order. In covenant relationships, under God's just, right, and life-supporting order, there is a basic claim, love your neighbor as yourself. God has empowered all human persons with ability to respond to this claim. Now, covenant relationships are broken in 2 ways. Number 7, first, when a person does not respond to a claim that God or another person makes upon a person, when that person has the God-given ability to respond, or when persons claim from God and others that which God has not intentionally established in his just right order. In covenant relations, Novak finds treasured balance between communal responsibility for the good of the whole and individual claims for respect and dignity of life. Both are required in modern reformed democratic societies. 2 points are important here, and then I move to China. One, covenant relations require separation of church and state. This does not mean, however, that the United States of America, as a democratic republic, does not have a religio foundation for its checks and balances style of democracy. It does. There certainly is religious and moral foundation to America's democracy, and that religious and moral foundation is precisely these 2 commandments, which generate a covenant-style way of living. Well, without these values as the foundation of our democratic republic, the Constitution and constitutional law would not have succeeded in its democratic experiment. Indeed, I would argue it is erosion of these 2 commandments and knowledge of both knowledge and practice of those that is, in some ways, putting our great experiment in democracy in danger. The second main point, and that's our theme of the paper, is that the democratic experiment that took place in the United States did so not by aiming at democracy, but by aiming at the kingdom of God, as that was understood to be expressed in God-human covenant relationships based on these 2 commandments. This point deserves enormous attention, but I'll only give it one support from the eminent scholar of democracy, Giovanni Sartori, who puts it this way: democracy has never been identified with a specific doctrinal source. It is rather a byproduct of the entire development of civilizations. I'm going to conclude this first part just to point out an irony. And that is that while the Judeo-Christian covenant relationship with God, the irony is this, that the Judeo-Christian covenant relationship with God was the higher end towards which people were seeking. But to get to that end, we spawned a checks and balances kind of government, democratic style, which is the child, as it were, of that larger Judeo-Christian covenant view. But this child of democratic means to achieve that higher end, this child is not under the parental control of the Judeo-Christian position. In other words, the Judeo-Christian position ends up being just one of many in a democratic republic. Moving then to part two, do we find in China the same kind of process whereby seeking to put into practice the moral way of ancient sage kings, which some call Confucianism, has that also issued forth in the development of checks and balances democracy as a side effect, as a means to that higher end? Now, I'm going to respond to that question by saying no, but to get to that, I want to, for the sake of those who may not be as familiar with the Confucian tradition, I want to present what that tradition is about and what are its moral underpinnings. To do that, I go to the formation of the Zhou dynasty, beginning around 1100 BCE, which again is parallel to the formation of the ancient state of Israel. Paralleling in that time frame, we see in the Chinese context the development of a tradition known as the moral way of ancient sage kings, again, which some call Confucianism. At the core of this tradition is the 5 millennia old point of view known as the Chinese family. The Chinese family is what gives a person his or her identity. The glue that holds the family together is xiao. Now, that gets translated into filial piety in English, but nobody these days knows what filial piety is. So I'm going to translate xiao into an expression, properly ordered family relations. Now, what are properly ordered family relations, or xiao, from the Chinese perspective? Basically this: each relationship has a person in an upper role and a person in a lower role. The person in the upper role has to provide food, clothing, shelter, and education to the person in the lower role, and the person in the lower role has responsibility to be obedient, loyal, grateful when receiving these from the person in the upper role. These combined roles of being responsible to provide food, clothing, shelter, and education, and then receiving and responding in return, obediently, loyally, and gratefully, this combined relationship is xiao and defines the Chinese properly ordered family. Now, traditionally, there have been 5 main ways that xiao has been expressed. And again, for those who are not familiar with the Confucian tradition, these 5 ways are the parent-child role, the husband and wife role, the older brother and younger brother relationship, the older friend to younger friend relationship, and then finally the leader to the people relationship. In each one of these, you have somebody in the upper position responsible to provide, and somebody in the lower position receiving, responsible to be obedient, loyal, and grateful in return. Now, in ancient Chinese civilization, not only was the family ordered this way, but so was the whole of society. Each of the families had a position in the larger whole, which was in some ways higher than some and lower than others. But again, this whole xiao concept brings together all into one great family, and the Chinese term for which is dajia, great family. That's the term that's used in Chinese parlance to talk about everybody, the one great family, but all in this kind of hierarchically structured xiao family order. The person at the head of the family clan gives instruction. The Chinese term for instruction is jiao. And its meaning is that a superior enacts or makes policy, and the inferior is to imitate and put into practice that policy. If you add the Chinese term hua to the term jiao, you get jiao hua, which is a leader's instruction to transform a people with standard ways of living. Throughout Chinese history, to instruct and to lead have been viewed as one and the same activity, whether in the family, in governing the town, the state, the province, or the larger state. Today, Chinese leaders still have the great and grave responsibility to instruct the people in a manner that will transform the people into one great family of shared values and social practice. To give examples of this, there is a plaque in Tiananmen Square that reads, 1 billion people, one mind. It's over in the corner. You'll find it if you look for it. Now, the ancient Zhou people brought to their hegemonic control of multiple clans in the ancient heartland of China their discernment of heaven. Heaven was discerned to be a cyclical, transcendental order that is good, right, and life-supporting. Now, the Zhou people, as they ousted the Shang before them, did not discern themselves to be in some kind of direct bloodline relationship with something more in life than meets the eye. Rather, the Zhou people saw themselves directly under heaven and responsible for heaven's order here in this world as sons of heaven, but this was not a bloodline relationship, but rather a connection of some kind of more quality or character. Just as heaven takes care of the people, the Son of Heaven is to take care of the people. From the earliest time of the name given to the ability to order and align the people with heaven's way, heaven's life-supporting good and right way, was called De. This inner capacity of De was the capacity of leaders to be under heaven so that heaven's way channeled through the leader out to the people, enabling 10,000 things to flourish. Early Zhou documents offer multiple examples of this kind of leadership, but we haven't time in this presentation to present them as much as we might like. But I want you to hear how this De was understood by the early Zhou people and how it required lifelong discipline for that De to be cultivated and continue to be active in the leader's instruction of the people. This comes from the Book of Documents. Heaven has removed and made an end to the great Shang mandate to lead. Now, there are many former wise kings of the Shang people under heaven. The Shang kings did at one point manage their people well, but in the end, the wise and good people lived in misery. These wise men, wrapping and carrying, leading and supporting the wives and children, wailing and calling to heaven, went to where nobody would come out and seize them. And heaven, having pity on his people in the four quarters, looked down with affection and took its mandate from the Shang and gave it to the zealous ones of the Zhou. May the Zhou king urgently pay attention to his De. Quickly, to summarize, Zhou understanding of De entails three discernments. One, the leader has some kind of direct relationship with heaven, and it is heaven who bestows this De on the leader or provides it innately to the leader. Two, a leader must exert vigilant will to place heaven's life-supporting order for the people first over his own self-interest for power, fame, and fortune. If a leader failed to provide for the people with instruction in accordance to heaven's order, then signs and omens, warnings would occur. And if a leader continued to fail, then heaven would remove its mandate from one leader and give it to another. Third, if a leader gave instruction in accordance with heaven's will, all things would flourish. Excuse me, I'm working to separate papers here. And if all things are do flourish under leaders putting aside self-interest for the sake of the larger whole. The leader is said to co-partner with heaven. In this worldview, together with cumulative innovations introduced to it over 2,500 years, the Ru or Confucian this is the tradition that the Ru transmits today. Now, some translate this term Ru meaning soft or weak. I'm not going to go into the derivation of that. 750 pages of my doctoral dissertation did that. But I would like to point out that there's a better way, I think, of translating this term Ru into English, and I refer to it as the moral way of ancient sage kings, Wang Dao, rather than calling it Confucianism, because the term Confucianism privileges one set of innovations made by a man called Kongzi, Confucius. But there are other important innovations into this tradition, one of which comes from the Duke of Zhou. And in fact, it is Kongzi who reverences the Duke of Zhou as highest of all moral leaders. Now, to get at who the Duke of Zhou was, I'm going to recount quickly his position. The person who founded the Zhou dynasty is posthumously known as King One, the patterned one, the one who patterned his way after the life-supporting way of heaven. But the one who actually threw out the Shang and brought the Zhou in is King Wu, the person who took martial arms. When King Wu died, his son, King Cheng, took control. His son was about 8 years old. So the younger brother of King Wu, who had passed away, the Duke of Zhou, becomes regent or instructor over young King Cheng. Now notice, this already puts some tension now between the political center, which gives instruction to the people, and somebody on the periphery of power, but not powerless, giving instruction to the political center. It is this duality or this tension which marks the Confucian tradition. The Duke of Zhou introduced innovations into this moral way of ancient sage kings. I'm going to focus on 5 aspects of those. First, the Duke of Zhou understood his position in relationship to the king to be one of assistance. And he did not seek this position, but rather he was appointed it. The king gave it to him. Number 2, the Duke of Zhou took the content of his instructions from the founder of the Zhou dynasty, King One. Number 3, the Duke of Zhou considered his appointment to give instruction not only to the young king, but to the whole of the Zhou people. And number 4, moreover, he was giving instruction to the people of the Shang now who were under the new leadership of the Zhou. And then number 5, and finally, when the Duke of Shao, another brother, challenged the Duke of Zhou in his giving instruction to the king, wondering whether the Duke of Zhou may have some kind of intentions to usurp power himself, the Duke of Zhou replies that he exerts himself to be a helpmate to the king. He exerts himself for the sake of heaven and the people. And I'm going to read this one piece because it is so emblematic of the Confucian or the moral way of ancient sage kings. Now it rests with me, the little child Tan, the name of the Duke of Zhou. I am as if floating on a great stream. I shall go and together with you cross it. Do not request me to retire. If men who are old and have perfected do not condescend to help, how will the Zhou succeed? You should brightly exert yourself to be a helpmate to the king and support 10 for the people. Now, what's innovative about the Duke of Zhou's position is that it's a bit like the child giving instruction to the parent. That's a bit new. Kongzi also introduced innovations into the moral way of ancient sage kings, and I'm not going to go through all of these now, but to highlight simply 4. Kongzi said that in manifesting one's position in this hierarchical order, what matters is not only the outward codified ritual, but your inward feeling that goes with it. And that feeling, number 2, can be cultivated into a great benevolence of feeling that goes beyond your family to other families. And number 3, that a person of this benevolence could and should seek influence on the leadership so that the leadership who might be putting self-interest first would put aside that self-interest for the sake of the people. And finally, instruction in this moral way does not belong to the noble class alone. Now, given time, I'm not going to take more time than I'd wanted to show how these innovations of Kongzi were indications of the family order becoming under challenge. I'm going to instead move to three questions by which to conclude my presentation. One, is the moral way of ancient sage kings something like the Judeo-Christian understanding of the God-human covenant? I've written on this elsewhere, and my answer is yes. Suffice it to say that both heaven and God are discerned to be transcendent and eminent, life-supporting, good, right, harmonious, peaceful orders, under which we stand in awe. Number two, is there some good compatibility between the biblical sense of covenant and shall family relations? Yes, and again, elsewhere I have argued that. And number three, does the moral way of ancient sage kings engage human agency involving intention, reason, free choice, will, and effort, and courage, like the covenant relationships do? Does it engage this agency to put aside self-interest for the sake of others? And my answer there is yes. So given these three compatibilities between the covenant of ancient Israel and the moral way of ancient sage kings in China, we can move to a second question, and that question is the key to the paper here, and that is, did efforts that took the practice of the moral way of ancient sage kings as one highest goal yield as a side effect, as a means to that higher end, a checks and balances style of limited government? And my answer is no. And the reason I'm going to put forward here has 2 points. On the one hand, Zhou leaders were fearful of Qian and were diligent to cultivate their de lest they lose their power. On the other hand, the leaders of Zhou stood in for Qian, took the place of Qian in making pronouncement and instruction to the people. And in this regard, you might say, in Sidney Mee's terms, that the sons of heaven violated the first commandment in that no man is God, in that they took the position of God in making those pronouncements. Second, while the innovative contribution of the Duke of Zhou introduced into the moral way of ancient sage kings the possibility of instructions to the political center, in other words, instruction could come from outside to the political center as well as from the political center out to the people. While the Duke of Zhou introduced that, rarely has that taken place over time. The top-down family control of the leader would often end up putting any challenge from instruction coming outside would end up putting that instruction coming from outside of the political center, exiling it or possibly silencing it through death. That somebody from outside could instruct the political center suggests that there could be a plurality of instructions coming out from outside to the political center, and that, too, China has not sustained for long. In ancient China, there was a time when many came forward with suggestions about how to realize the heaven-guided community. But what happened is that once you might have a plurality of perspectives being offered to the political center, but the political center would choose one of them as the one instruction that would go out. So plurality in, singularity going out. So then the question turning to a final question then, if plurality was often reduced to a singular plurality of instruction coming in from outside was reduced to a singular instruction going out, could we expect to see a kind of Confucian principled pluralism like we have argued for in the first part of this paper as Christian principled pluralism? And the answer right now is mixed. I do hear among young Chinese Confucian scholars that they're no longer seeking to be the one instruction for the state, but they're seeking instead to be one of many instructions offered to the political center. And that moves in the direction of a Confucian principled pluralism. But I want to conclude with one final point, and that is that as Chinese people today, in multiple ways, are seeking for the better life, a higher end, right? They're going to have to sustain a plurality of points of view in terms of seeking that higher end. And in supporting that plurality, they're going to have to say to each other, you are not God, in the same way that we did it in the shaping of our democratic republic. They're going to have to say that to sustain that plurality of perspectives by saying to each other, you are not God, and loving each other, giving each other space for their divergence of points of view. They're going to have to sustain that kind of plural discussion over a period of time in order to eventually develop the checks and balances style of democracy as a means to the higher goal of the good life which the Chinese people seek. And I'll just close by saying this is my hope for China.